The morning Maria Whitfield sank to her knees in the dust of her ruined garden, and wept was the morning everything in her life had finally come undone at once. And it was also, though she did not know it yet, the morning that would change the rest of her life entirely. It was the summer of 1878, in the sun-scorched territory of New Mexico, and the little town of Harlan's Creek sat baking under a sky so blue and so relentless that it seemed almost cruel in its beauty. The land out here did not make promises. It took, and occasionally, when it felt generous, it gave back just enough to keep a person believing. Maria had believed for 3 years. She had believed in the small square of earth behind her adobe house, in the seeds she pressed into the ground with her own 2 hands, in the rows of beans and squash, and the tomato plants she had tended like they were children. She had believed that the garden would grow, that it would sustain her, that the labor of her hands would be enough. But the drought had come again. It had come the way it always came to that part of the territory, without warning and without mercy, pressing down on the land like a flat iron on cloth. And by the second week of July, every plant in Maria's garden had given up. The beans hung limp and brown on their stakes. The squash had curled inward on themselves. The tomato plants, which had been the last to hold on, finally let go sometime in the night, and when Maria stepped out into the early morning heat and saw the whole of it laying wilted and defeated in the cracked earth, something inside her simply broke. She was 24 years old and she had been alone for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had gone out to repair a fence line on the eastern edge of their property in May of the previous year and had not come back. They found his horse 2 days later, grazing along the creek bed. They found Thomas a week after that, at the bottom of a ravine. The doctor in Harlan's Creek said it had been the fall that killed him, that his horse must have spooked at something along the ridge. It was the kind of death that made no sense and offered no comfort, the kind that left a person standing in the middle of their own life wondering what to do next. Maria had stayed. Her family was in Santa Fe, 3 days' ride to the north, and her mother had written twice asking her to come home, but Maria had looked at the small adobe house that she and Thomas had built together, at the curtains she had sewn herself and hung in the 2 front windows, at the garden she had planted in the first spring of their marriage, and she had decided that she was not ready to surrender it all. She stayed because leaving felt too much like agreeing that everything they had worked for had been for nothing. So she stayed and she worked, and she kept the garden going, and she took in mending from the women in town to earn enough coin for flour and salt and the occasional slab of salted pork from Greer's Mercantile. She was not wealthy and she was not comfortable, but she was managing. Or she had been managing, until the drought took the last thing she had that was truly hers. When she fell to her knees in the dust between the rows of dead plants, the sun had barely cleared the ridge to the east, and the air still held the thin memory of night's coolness. She pressed her hands flat against the earth that was dry and hard as baked clay, and she cried the way a person cries when they are utterly alone and have been holding everything together for so long that the effort has simply become too great. She did not make any sound at first. The tears just came, slipping down her cheeks and dropping into the dust, which swallowed them without a trace. Then the sound came too, a low, aching sound that she pressed into the back of her hand. She did not hear the horse until it had already stopped. The sound of hooves on the dry road at the front of her property had been going on for some time before it registered in her grief-fogged mind, and by the time she looked up, wiping her face quickly with the back of her wrist, the rider had already come around the side of the house and was sitting in the saddle not 20 feet from where she knelt in the dirt. He was not from Harlan's Creek. She knew that immediately, because Harlan's Creek was a small enough town that she knew every man in it by name and face and temperament. This man she had never seen before. He was perhaps 28 or 30, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples from sweat and road dust. He wore a plain brown canvas shirt and working trousers, and his hat was pulled low against the morning sun, and he sat his horse the way men who had been riding since boyhood sit their horses, without any apparent effort, as if the animal were simply an extension of himself. His horse was a dark bay with a blaze down its nose, and it shifted slightly as its rider pulled it to a stop, but the man's hands on the reins were easy and quiet, and the animal settled again at once. For a moment neither of them spoke. Maria became acutely aware of how she must look, kneeling in the dirt with her eyes red and her hair half escaped from its braid, and her apron dusted with the evidence of work already done that morning. She got to her feet with what dignity she could manage and squared her shoulders and looked at the man on the horse. "Can I help you?" she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. The man took off his hat. That simple gesture, the way he lifted it from his head and held it at his side, told her something about him that she filed away without quite knowing why. "I am sorry to disturb you, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that came from a man who chose his words deliberately. "My name is Elias Carson. I am riding through to Pico's and I was hoping I might water my horse at your well. I can see the handle from here. I would have gone straight to it, but I did not feel right about using a person's well without asking." Maria looked at him for a moment. "The well is there," she said, gesturing toward the stone-ringed well on the south side of the yard. "Help yourself." She turned away then, because she did not particularly want a stranger watching her, while the evidence of her misery was still fresh on her face. She walked back toward the wilted rows of plants and crouched down beside one of the tomato plants, though there was nothing to be done for it. She pressed her fingers around the base of the stem, which had gone papery and thin, and stared at it. She heard the horse being led to the well. She heard the creak of the well rope and the splash of water into the bucket, and then the soft sounds of the animal drinking. She kept her eyes on her dead garden. "Drought got to it," the man said. She looked up. He was standing at the edge of the garden, not close, keeping a respectful distance, with his hat back on his head and his horse standing ground-tied behind him. He was looking at the plants with a kind of serious attention that was somehow not intrusive. "Yes," Maria said. "Good soil, though," he said, and he crouched down and scooped a small handful of the earth and let it fall through his fingers. "You can see it. It holds together right, or it would if there were water in it. Clay in the right proportion. Not too much." He looked at her. "I am sorry about your garden." She did not know what it was about those 5 words, said plainly, and without any of the polished condolence she had grown so tired of hearing in the months after Thomas died, but something in them cracked her open again. She pressed her lips together and looked away. "It was the last thing I had going," she said, and then stopped, because she had not meant to say that and she did not know why she had said it to a stranger. She heard him stand up. "I understand," he said quietly. "I will leave you to your morning, ma'am. Thank you for the water." She heard him walk back to his horse. She heard leather creak as he mounted. She kept her eyes on the ruined garden. "My name is Maria Whitfield," she said, without looking up, and she was not entirely sure why she said that either. There was a brief pause. "I know who you are," the man said. "I stopped for supplies at Greer's store in town last night. He mentioned you. Said you were the best seamstress in the county and the stubbornest woman he had ever met, and he meant both as a compliment." Despite everything, despite the tears still drying on her face and the dead garden and the hollow feeling in her chest, Maria almost smiled. Because that was exactly the sort of thing Silas Greer would say, and he was not wrong on either count. She heard the horse move away. She sat in the dirt beside her ruined garden for a long time after that, listening to the hooves fade down the road, and then she went inside and washed her face and started the day. She did not expect to think about Elias Carson again. She thought about him all day. It was not the thinking of a woman who had been struck by a man's handsome face, though she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that he had a strong, good face, the kind that looked like it had been shaped by weather and work into something that would not soften easily. It was more that there had been something in the way he had said those words, "I am sorry about your garden," something in the simple directness of it, that stayed with her. He had not said it will come back, or you will plant again next year. He had just been sorry straightforwardly, and then he had known enough to leave. She went to bed that night still thinking about it, and still thinking about the well of grief that had opened up in her that morning, and she was too tired and too worn down to fight either thing, so she let herself think and she fell asleep in the middle of it, and the night passed. The sound of a wagon on the road woke her before sunrise. Maria lay still for a moment, listening. Wagon traffic on this road at that hour was unusual. The road that ran past her property was a secondary track that connected Harlan's Creek to the smaller settlement of Ridgway to the east, and most of the commercial traffic went the other way, through the main pass. A wagon at this hour meant someone with a reason. She got up and put on her dress and boots and went to the front door. The sky was still that particular shade of dark blue that comes just before the sun decides to commit to rising, and in the thin early light she could see a wagon pulled up at her gate. A horse was hitched to the post, and beside the wagon a figure was unloading something. She took her father's old rifle from beside the door out of pure practicality and not out of any particular fear, and she walked down the path to the gate. The figure looked up. It was Elias Carson. He had his hat on and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was lifting a large sack from the wagon bed. Behind him in the wagon she could see more sacks and several wooden crates and a bundle of what appeared to be straw. Maria stopped at the gate. She looked at him and she looked at the wagon and she looked back at him. "What is this?" she said. He set the sack down carefully at the side of the road. "Seeds," he said, "and a good quantity of composted soil from the livery stable in Ridgway. The liveryman there was glad to have it hauled away, so it cost me only the hauling." He paused. "I also brought a rain barrel and some guttering, if you will let me fit it to your roof's edge. It will catch what rain there is when it comes, and direct it toward the garden." The barrel was in a yard outside Ridgway, belonged to a family that moved on and left it behind. Greer said I could have it for $1. Maria stared at him. The sky was going from dark blue to the pale, tentative purple of very early morning, and in that light Elias Carson stood beside his wagon looking at her with an expression that was steady and patient and completely without expectation. He was not waiting for her to be grateful. He was not waiting for anything, it seemed, except whatever she chose to do. "You went to Ridgway," Maria said slowly, "last night. There is a road. It is about 8 miles. My horse did not mind." "You went to Ridgway last night," she said again, "to buy seeds and collect stable compost and find a rain barrel, and you came back here before sunrise." "I came back before sunrise because I thought you might want to plant early, before the heat of the day." Maria set the rifle butt down on the ground and stood holding it loosely, and looked at this man she had met for approximately 4 minutes the previous morning. She could not quite make sense of him. She was not accustomed to not being able to make sense of things. "Why?" she said. It was the only word that really mattered. He seemed to consider his answer. "Because the soil is good," he said at last. "It would be a waste not to plant it." She studied him for another long moment. "That is not the full answer," she said. The faintest trace of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "No," he agreed, "but it is an honest part of it." She was quiet for a moment. The birds were starting now, a few dry notes scattered across the stillness. Then she stepped forward and lifted the latch on the gate. "You had better come in then," Maria said. "I will make coffee." He brought the sacks and the crates in through the gate, and she went inside and built up the cook fire and put the coffee on. And by the time she carried 2 mugs out to the yard, the sun was fully committed to rising, and Elias Carson had the first of the composted soil spread across the nearest bed of the garden. Working it into the dry earth with a long-handled spade he had apparently also brought, which leaned against the wall of the house. He took the coffee from her with a nod of thanks and drank it standing up, looking at the garden with that same serious, appraising look he had given it the morning before. "What did you have growing?" he asked. She sat on the step and told him. Beans, both the climbing variety and the bush beans she had learned from her grandmother to grow in the shade of the taller plants. Squash, 2 kinds. Tomatoes, the small sweet variety that her mother grew in Santa Fe and had sent her seeds for the first year. A row of chilies because this was New Mexico and no garden was complete without them. Some herbs along the south wall where they would get shelter and good sun. He listened to all of it. He asked questions about the spacing she had used and the depth of her planting rows, and they were the questions of someone who knew gardens, not just as a concept, but practically from the ground up. "Where did you learn to garden?" she asked him. "My mother," he said. "In East Texas, where I grew up, she could grow things in ground that looked like it had given up entirely. I used to think it was a kind of stubbornness on her part." A pause. "Later I understood it was just knowledge, knowing what a plant needs versus what a plant wants, giving it what it needs." "What is the difference?" Maria asked. He glanced at her. "A plant wants water every day," he said, "but what it needs is roots deep enough to find its own water. You water too much, too easy, the roots stay shallow. You hold back a little, the roots go looking. That is how you build something that can survive a dry summer." Maria looked at him. "You are talking about more than plants," she said. He smiled then. It was the first time she had seen him fully smile, and it changed his face considerably, pulled warmth into the lines around his mouth and his eyes, and she found herself wanting to keep it there. "Maybe," he said, and went back to working the soil. They spent the morning together in the garden. Maria was not a person who stood aside and watched others work. And so she tied a cloth around her head against the sun, and took the second spade that was in the wagon and worked alongside him, turning the dry earth and working in the composted soil until it was dark and rich and crumbly in her hands. They worked mostly in a companionable silence, with occasional exchanges about the work itself, and once or twice about other things. She learned that he had grown up in East Texas, the son of a farmer and a woman who could make things grow in any soil. He had come west 10 years ago at 18, following the cattle trade north and west as the drives moved with the market, working as a ranch hand and occasionally as a drover. And he had worked cattle drives to Dodge City twice, and once all the way up to Cheyenne. He was good with horses and better with cattle, and he said without particular pride, a decent enough shot when the occasion required it, though he preferred to arrange things so that occasions did not require it. She told him less about herself because she was more guarded by nature than he appeared to be, but she told him about Santa Fe and her parents and the sisters she had grown up with, and she told him, because it seemed only honest, that she was a widow, that her husband had died 14 months ago. He did not say he was sorry. He said, "That is a hard thing to carry alone," and she thought again, as she had thought yesterday, that this man had a particular quality of saying exactly what was true without dressing it up or down, and that it was both unsettling and deeply restful. By noon they had worked the entire garden. All 5 beds, turned and fed and raked smooth. The rows were straight and the soil was the right color and texture, and Maria crouched at the end of the longest bed and took a handful of it and pressed it and let it fall, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since morning yesterday. Then they planted. He had brought seeds for beans and for squash, tomato starts wrapped in damp cloth that he had gotten from someone's cold cellar in Ridgeway, and 2 different varieties of chili. He had also, and she was not sure when she noticed this or quite what to make of it, brought lavender seeds, which were not practical in any agricultural sense, but which she had once told no one at all, because she had only thought it, that she would love to grow along the south wall if she ever had the seeds. She looked at the small paper envelope labeled in neat, plain lettering. "Where did you get lavender seeds?" she asked. He was pressing beans into a row without looking up. "Greer carries them," he said. "For the women who want kitchen gardens. He says most women who come in for vegetable seeds end up buying a packet even if they say they will not." He glanced at her. "He did not mention you specifically, but I thought if the offer stood." She looked at the envelope. "The offer stood," she said quietly, and she pressed the first lavender seeds into the soil along the south wall herself with her own hands, patting the earth gently over them. They ate a late lunch on the step, bread and salt pork and some dried apricots she had in the house, and the second round of coffee, and the afternoon had gone golden and long by then. Elias was fixing the guttering to the edge of the roof, standing on a wooden crate he had upended for the purpose, and Maria was sitting on the step watching him work and not pretending she was not watching him work, because by that point they were past the stage of pretending. "You were riding to Pico's," she said. "I was," he agreed, reaching to tighten a nail with the claw of the hammer. "That is southeast of here." "It is. Ridgeway is east." He said nothing for a moment, adjusting the angle of the gutter so it directed toward the barrel. "Ridgeway is east," he confirmed. "So you went east to go southeast." "A person sometimes takes a longer road," he said. Maria looked at her hands, which were dirt-stained and calloused from the morning's work. "What is in Pico's?" she asked. "A man who owes me wages from a drive 2 months ago," Elias said. "He said he would settle up when he reached Pico's. He reached Pico's 3 weeks ago. He came down from the crate and looked at the gutter, then at the rain barrel positioned at its base and gave a satisfied nod. That will work. Even a modest rain, half an inch, will fill that barrel twice over at this roof pitch." "Thank you," Maria said. "For all of this, you did not have to." He picked up the hammer and looked at her in that direct, unhurried way he had. "No," he said, "I did not have to." There was a long moment in which they simply looked at one another, and in that moment something shifted like a piece of ground settling after rain, a slow, inevitable movement that rearranged the landscape just slightly and left it different than it had been. "Where do you sleep when you are between places?" Maria asked. It was a practical question, and she asked it practically. "My bedroll," he said. "I have camped on the road. The nights are warm enough." "There is a barn," she said, and she said it with the same matter-of-fact directness that she had used for everything today. "It is not much. Thomas kept 2 horses in it, but both horses were sold after he died. The hay is old, but it is clean and the roof is sound, if you need to stay and rest before Pico's." He was quiet for a moment. "I would not want to trouble you," he said. "You brought me seeds and soil and spent a day replanting my garden," she said. "A night in a barn is a very small thing by comparison." He smiled again, that full, warm smile. "Then I accept," he said, "with thanks." Elias Carson stayed 3 days. The first night he slept in the barn, and in the morning he rose before she did, and she found him when she went out at dawn to water the newly planted beds, drawing water from the well with long, efficient strokes of the pump handle. He had already given her single remaining mule a bucket of water and a handful of the grain she kept in the small bin inside the barn. On the second day he rode into Harlan's Creek and came back with more water for the garden and a small piece of salt pork from Greer's as thanks for the accommodations, he said, setting it on her kitchen table as straightforwardly as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He also came back with news that a neighbor of hers, a man named Culver whose property abutted hers to the north, had been inquiring about her property and whether she intended to keep it or sell. Said he had asked about it before, Elias told her, sitting at her kitchen table while she put together a meal. "He has asked 3 times, Maria said, and there was something firm and final in her voice. "Culver has wanted this land since before Thomas died. He has wanted it since we built here because our access to the creek cuts through where he would like to run a new fence line." She set the pan on the fire. "I will not sell." "I did not think you would," Elias said. "I told him as much." She turned to look at him. "You told him I would not sell." "I said it was my understanding that you were not interested in selling." He met her eyes. "Was I wrong?" "No," she said. "You were not wrong." She turned back to the stove. "But I am curious what gave you that understanding, seeing as we have known one another for all of 2 days. There was a brief pause, and then he said, "Some things do not take long to understand." She did not respond to that with words, but she did not try to argue with it either. On the 3rd day, he helped her mend a section of the fence on the south side of the property that had been leaning at an angle for months, a job she had been meaning to get to and had not had time for. They worked side by side with posts and wire and a mallet, and he taught her a way of setting a post that she had not known, driving it at a slight angle into the ground so that the wire tension pulled it back to straight rather than pulling it further over. "Your husband," he said at one point, not cautiously but with a plain, respectful directness. "He was a good man." "Yes," Maria said simply. "He was. He was kind and steady, and he worked very hard. He loved this place." She looked along the line of the fence toward the ridge in the east. "I think what hurts most sometimes is that I am not entirely sure I was as in love with him as a wife ought to be. I cared for him deeply. But the kind of love the stories talk about, the kind that makes a person feel." She stopped. "Feel what?" Elias said quietly. She shook her head. "It does not matter. He was a good man and I was a good wife to him, and I am not ashamed of any of it." She drove the mallet against the post with a clean, solid stroke. "But I have wondered since he died whether I was so determined to stay here because I loved this land and this life, or because I was proving something." "What would you be proving?" She looked at him. "That I am not the kind of woman who leaves." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Or," he said carefully, "you stayed because this is yours, what you built. And leaving it would feel like losing yourself." The words landed in her chest like something dropped from a height. She looked away and pressed her lips together, and after a moment she nodded once slowly. "Yes," she said. That evening after supper, they sat on the front step in the cooling dark. The stars out here were unreasonable in their abundance, thick and bright, because Harlan's Creek was small enough and the land around it empty enough that there was nothing to dim them. Maria sat with her knees drawn up and her arms around them and watched the sky, and Elias sat beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the night air. "You will go to Pico's tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. "I should," he said. She was quiet for a moment. And then I collect my wages," he said, and then he paused. "I have not thought much past that." She said nothing for a little while. The crickets were going in the dry grass along the road, and somewhere far off a coyote was saying something to the dark. "You could come back," she said. She said it quietly, and she said it without looking at him, and she said it without any particular insistence. She just said it, the way she had said everything over these 3 days, directly and without embellishment. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man taking a thing seriously. "I could come back," Elias said at last, and his voice was low and careful and warm. He left the next morning before the heat settled in. He saddled the dark bay and tied his bedroll and his saddlebags to the back and came to the front gate where Maria stood, and he touched the brim of his hat. "The seeds should come up in about a week," he said. "The tomato starts will need water every other day for the first 2 weeks while they establish. The beans will be faster, they will show in 4 or 5 days. I know how to tend a garden," Maria said, but she was smiling when she said it. "You do," he agreed. "You know better than most people I have met." He looked at her for a moment. "I will be back, Maria." He was the first person in a very long time who had said her given name, and he said it without asking permission, which she thought under ordinary circumstances she might object to, but she found that she did not object at all. "I know," she said. He rode east. She watched until the road bent and the dust settled and there was nothing left to watch. Then she turned back to the garden where the seeds were waiting in their dark, damp beds for the sun to do its work. It rained that night. Not a great downpour, not the kind of rain that filled creek beds and made the road treacherous, but a steady, quiet rain that lasted through the night and into the gray morning, soft and purposeful. When Maria went out at first light, she found the rain barrel full, and the garden beds dark and glistening, and the first, tentative curving of a bean sprout breaking the soil in the closest bed, a tiny pale hook of green pushing up into the wet air. She stood and looked at it for a long time in the rain, with her hair getting wet and her boots darkening in the mud, and she thought she was going to cry, but instead she laughed. A short, surprised laugh that was real and unguarded in a way she had not been for a very long time. The beans came up in 4 days, just as he had said. The squash followed 2 days after that, the broad, thick cotyledons pushing up and spreading almost overnight into something vigorous and substantial. The tomato starts, which she watered every other day, took hold and began to put out new growth, tender green shoots reaching up from the center of each plant. The lavender along the south wall took 2 weeks, but when it came all at once, a dozen small gray-green shoots appearing over the course of a single morning, so fine and so precise that Maria got down on her knees to look at them up close, her face near the soil, and the air near them already carried the faintest suggestion of their eventual scent. She wrote to her mother in Santa Fe. She did not mention Elias Carson. She wrote about the garden coming back, about the rain barrel and the new guttering, and she wrote about being all right in a way that she had not been able to write honestly for the past 14 months, because this time she believed it. 3 weeks after he left, a letter arrived for her at the post at Greer's store. She knew his handwriting before she had fully registered that she expected to know his handwriting, the plain, precise letters of a man who had taught himself to write not as an art but as a useful skill, each letter formed with deliberate clarity. He was still in Pecos. The man who owed him wages had been difficult about the matter, and it had taken longer than expected to settle, and he would have been on the road sooner, but he had gotten word of a cattle drive forming up at a ranch outside Pecos that was short a drover, and the wages offered were good, and the drive would take him north and east and eventually back in the direction of Harlan's Creek. He expected to be through in 6 weeks. He asked about the garden. He asked whether the beans had come in. He asked at the end of the letter, in the same plain and direct way he said everything, whether she was all right. Maria sat at her kitchen table in the warm afternoon and read the letter twice, and then a third time, and then she got out the good writing paper that she kept for correspondence with her mother, and she wrote back. She wrote about the beans and the squash and the tomato plants, which were doing wonderfully, better than any crop she had grown in 3 years, and she suspected it was the composted soil making the difference. She wrote about the rain barrel, which had already been full and emptied and full again twice. She wrote about the lavender, the way it had come up all at once in a single morning, and how she was looking forward to it flowering in the fall. She wrote at the end that she was all right, and that she would be glad when 6 weeks was up. She sent the letter with the next rider going east. The 6 weeks that followed were the most productive she had spent since Thomas died. Something had shifted in her, some quality of listlessness and grief that she had not even fully recognized until it began to lift. She took in more mending than usual and did it quickly and well. She expanded the garden, tearing up another 5 feet of dry ground on the eastern side, and working it with the compost she had been collecting from her own kitchen waste, and she planted a late crop of greens that the previous rains had made possible. She also began, for the first time since Thomas died, to think about what she actually wanted. It was a strange and unsettling kind of thinking, because she had spent 3 years wanting only to survive and to hold on, and before that she had wanted what she had been told to want, which was a good marriage and a settled home, and she had gotten both those things but had somehow never quite gotten around to asking herself what she wanted under all of that. She was not sure the question had felt permitted. But Elias Carson had sat on her step in the dark and told her that she had stayed because this place was hers and leaving would feel like losing herself. And he had said it without any judgment and without any pity, and without any of the gentle, suffocating concern she got from the women in Harlan's Creek, who thought she ought to find another husband quickly before she got too set in her ways. He had said it as a plain fact, as though there were nothing wrong with being a woman who needed her own piece of ground to stand on. She thought about that a great deal in the 6 weeks she waited. She also thought about the way he had smiled at her that first morning when she said the offer of lavender seed stood. She thought about the comfortable silences they had sat in on the front step. She thought about the way he said her name. Harlan's Creek was a small town, and the news that a man had spent 3 days at the Whitfield widow's property had not gone entirely unnoticed. The Reverend Alton's wife, a narrow-lipped woman named Constance who meant well in the way that very irritating people mean well, appeared at Maria's gate one afternoon with a pie as a pretext, and spent 20 minutes implying, in the politely coded way of small-town church women in 1878, that Maria's reputation was a delicate thing, and that extended visits from unknown men were not perhaps the most careful way to tend it. Maria received this information with the politeness that was her default in social situations she found objectionable, and when Constance had gone, she set the pie on the table and stood looking at it and considered the question of her reputation, which was a real thing and a practical thing in a town of this size in this year. She was not naive about the world she lived in. She knew that a woman alone was already at a certain disadvantage, that she depended on the goodwill of the town's merchants and the basic respect of her neighbors for her ability to conduct her business and her life. She knew that being a widow rather than a wife placed her in a particular social category, and that category came with certain expectations of decorum. She also knew that Elias Carson had done nothing that any decent person could point to as objectionable. He had helped a neighbor. He had slept in a barn. He had left when it was time to leave. She ate the pie and decided that she was not going to let Constance Alton's opinion change anything. The letter she got at 7 weeks, not 6, said he had been delayed by a lame horse and a longer drive than expected, but that he was now 4 days east of Harlan's Creek and would be arriving shortly. He said that the drive had gone well and that his saddlebags were in better shape than when he had left. He said he hoped the garden was still doing well. He did not say anything else except that he was looking forward to seeing her, and those 6 words sat in the middle of the letter's plain, practical language like something quietly alive. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the heat had finally begun to relent, and the air carried the first suggestion of fall. Maria was in the garden deadheading the tomato plants to encourage the last crop before frost when she heard his horse on the road, and she did not question how she knew it was him. She just knew. She was standing at the gate when he pulled up, and he was dustier than she remembered and the horse looked tired, but when he swung down and tied the reins to the post and turned to face her, the expression on his face was the same as it had been that first morning on the step, steady and warm and a little more open than was perhaps professionally wise. "You came back," Maria said. "I said I would," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Come and see the garden," she said. He followed her around the side of the house and stopped at the edge of the garden beds and was silent for a moment, taking in the green and abundant rows, the bean plants heavy with their second crop, the squash sprawling luxuriantly across the ground, the tomatoes red and gold and clustered on vines that had had to be staked up a second time because they grew too heavy, and along the south wall, the lavender, still in its early growth but already clearly something. A long gray-green line of it sending up small spikes of color that had not yet opened but promised purple come another week or two. "You grew all of this," he said. "You brought the soil," Maria said. "You did the work," he said, and his voice had something in it that made her look at him. They stood at the edge of the garden for a long moment. The sun was getting low and the light was going golden and warm across the beds, the kind of light that makes everything look like it was painted by someone with a generous hand. "Elias," Maria said. "Yes," he said, and he was already looking at her. "I have been thinking," she said, "for the past 7 weeks about what I want." He was quiet, listening. "I want this land," she said. "I will not sell it and I will not leave it and I will not let Culver or anyone else take it. That is not a condition that is going to change." "I know," he said. "And I want the garden," she said. "And I want," she stopped, and then she decided that she was done with being careful about the things she wanted, done with the long habit of wanting quietly. "I want you to come back again, not to pass through and not to do a job and leave. I want you to come back because you want to come back." Elias Carson looked at her for a long moment. The golden light was all over the garden and over his face, and he looked at her with an expression that was so open and so unguarded that it made her breath catch. "Maria," he said, and his voice was low, "I have been thinking about this since I rode away 8 weeks ago." "And," she said. And I have been spending a cattle drive convincing myself that a woman like you does not need a man showing up out of nowhere and complicating her life," he said. "And then I got your letter about the lavender coming up all at once in a single morning, and I stopped convincing myself of anything." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "The lavender," she said. "The lavender," he said, and he was smiling, that full, warm smile that she had missed without letting herself admit it. A man who gets a letter about lavender sprouting and reads it 3 times is not a man who has his feelings sorted. Maria took a step toward him, which was not a small thing, and both of them knew it. "Then come back," she said. "Stay." "As what?" he asked, and his voice was careful, not because he was uncertain but because he wanted to be sure he understood her. "As a man I want to know better," she said plainly. "As a man who could make himself useful around a property while I decide whether I like him as much as I think I do." The corner of her mouth curved. "I suspect I will." He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them to something that was neither distant nor forward but something in between, something that held possibility and patience in equal measure. "I suspect you will too," he said. "I can be very useful." "I already know that," she said. He stayed. He did not move into the house, because it was not 1878's way for a man who was courting a widow to move into her house, and because Maria had her own sense of how things ought to be done, and she was not about to let small-town gossip have any more ammunition than was necessary. He took a room at the boarding house in Harlan's Creek, which was run by a practical woman named Della Marsh, who asked no unnecessary questions and kept a clean table, and he rode out to the Whitfield property every morning and worked through the day and went back to town in the evenings. In those evenings at the property, things grew between them the way the garden grew, which is to say steadily and with increasing certainty, and sometimes surprisingly fast when you looked away for a moment. They talked. They talked about everything. About East Texas and Santa Fe, about what it was like to grow up with sisters, about the cattle drives and the wide empty country north of here, about the way the Comanche had been pushed from their ancestral lands in a series of actions that Elias had witnessed parts of, and spoke about with a plain disgust that Maria found quietly significant, because many of the men in Harlan's Creek and in the territory generally spoke of such things with indifference or approval. And indifference was its own kind of cruelty. He had seen things done in the name of settlement and progress that he was not proud to have been adjacent to, and he said so without being dramatic about it, and without pretending it was more complicated than it was. They talked about Thomas, because Maria felt it was important to be honest about who she had been before and who she was now, and Elias listened to all of it without jealousy or discomfort, because he was the kind of man who understood that a person's history was not a threat. They argued, too. Once sharply, about whether the mule needed new shoes, because Maria thought the mule's feet were fine and Elias thought the left front was showing wear, and they both turned out to be half right, and the argument ended with them both crouched beside the mule's left front foot in the gathering dark, and the mule looking profoundly bored, and then they both started laughing at the same time and could not stop for a full minute. He was at her property one October morning when Culver came. Culver was a heavy man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had never been particularly friendly and had not improved with age. He rode up to the property on a large roan horse and dismounted at the gate with the air of a man who had decided in advance that this visit would go the way he wanted it to go. Maria came out to the gate, and Elias came around from the barn and stood slightly behind and to the right of her, which was not a threatening position, but was a present one. "Mrs. Whitfield," Culver said, with a nod that was barely a nod, "I have come again about the property. I have spoken with a lawyer in Tucson, and I believe you will find my new offer to be very reasonable." He produced an envelope from inside his coat. "I have put it in writing this time. Mr. Culver," Maria said, "I have told you 3 times that I am not selling this property." "You are a woman alone," Culver said, and he said it the way someone says a thing they have decided is an argument. "You cannot work this land by yourself. You cannot protect it. You cannot improve it to its value. It is, with respect, more than your situation can manage." Maria looked at him steadily. "My situation," she said quietly, "is entirely my own business." "Be that as it may," Culver said, "the fact is that this land would be better used as part of a larger holding, and you would be better served by the funds to start fresh somewhere more suitable." "Somewhere more suitable," Maria repeated. Her voice was very level. "And where do you imagine that to be, Mr. Culver?" "Your family is in Santa Fe," he said, "or perhaps one of the towns with more amenities for a woman in your position." "Mrs. Whitfield," Elias said, and his voice was conversational and unhurried, "would you like me to show Mr. Culver off the property?" Culver looked at him for the first time with any real attention. "Who are you?" "My name is Elias Carson," he said. "I help manage this property." Culver looked at Maria. "You have taken on a hired man." "I have," Maria said, and she did not correct the description, because in the most practical sense it was accurate enough. Culver was quiet for a moment, recalculating. Then he said, "The offer stands in that envelope. Read it when you have time." "I will not read it," Maria said, "because I am not going to sell, and reading offers does not change that. It only gives you the impression that there is a conversation to be had, and there is not. I am sorry for your trouble in coming." Culver took the envelope back, which told her that he had not really expected to leave it. He mounted his horse and rode back down the road without another word. Maria stood at the gate for a moment after he had gone, and then she turned and walked back toward the house, and Elias fell into step beside her. "Thank you," she said. "You did not need me," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I did not mind that you were there." He was quiet for a moment. "He will come back," he said. "I know," Maria said. "He always comes back." She stopped and turned to face him. "That is the problem with this property. It is valuable to him, and I am a woman, and he thinks that combination means eventually he wins." She looked at Elias. "He is wrong." "He is," Elias agreed. He looked at her in the morning light, with the garden behind her and the adobe house behind that, and his expression was something she had come to know very well in the past 2 months, the expression of a man who has made up his mind about something and is about to say it plainly. "Maria," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have not made you any promises," he said, "because I was not sure it was my place to. Because I knew you needed time and I wanted to give it to you without making it feel like a negotiation." He stopped. "But I want to make you a promise now." She waited. "I do not want to be the man who helps manage this property," he said. "I want to be the man whose property this is. Alongside yours." He looked at her very directly. "I want to marry you, Maria, if you will have me, not to protect you from Culver or from anything else, because I want to spend my life with you, because I have not wanted anything the way I want that since I can remember." The morning was very clear and very still around them. The lavender along the south wall had opened its flowers the previous week, and the color of it, that soft, impossible purple, was visible from where they stood, and the smell of it was just barely in the air, warm and herbal and sweet. Maria looked at him for a long moment. "You are not asking because of Culver," she said. "I am asking because of you," he said. "Because of who you are. Because you knew the difference between your tomato plants wanting daily water and needing deep roots. Because you cried over a dead garden and then got up and got back to work the same morning. Because you said you were done being careful about what you want, and I want to be one of the things you are not careful about wanting." She took a breath. "Yes," she said, and it came out completely steady. "Yes, Elias, I will marry you." He crossed the remaining distance between them and cupped her face in both hands, and he kissed her. And it was the first time he had kissed her, and it was not tentative or hurried, but something unhurried and certain and real. And she put her hands on his arms and kissed him back. And the morning went on around them, warm and clear, and the lavender moved very slightly in a small wind coming down from the ridge. They were married on the first Saturday of November, 1878, in the little church in Harlan's Creek, by Reverend Alton, whose wife Constance managed to look both surprised and satisfied at the same time, as women who have predicted things often do. Maria wore her best dress, dark blue wool with the buttons she had polished twice the night before, and Elias wore a coat she had not seen him in before, a good dark coat that he had apparently purchased in Harlan's Creek that week without telling her, and he looked so unexpectedly formal and so clearly himself under all of it that she had to press her lips together to hold back something that was partly a smile and partly tears. Her mother, Elena Reyes Whitfield, had made the 3-day ride from Santa Fe with Maria's younger sister Isabella, and when Maria saw them arrive at the church, she abandoned all composure and crossed the churchyard at an undignified speed and held her mother for a long time. Her mother, who was a small and absolutely indestructible woman, held her back just as hard. "He brought you seeds," Elena said quietly, when they finally stepped back and looked at each other, "after seeing you cry over a garden. That is a man worth having." "I know," Maria said. "Your father would have liked him," Elena said. Maria's father had died 6 years ago of a fever that took him quickly. It was one of the things that had shaped Maria, the loss of him, and the fact that her mother had kept everything going after, had kept the household and raised the younger children and not surrendered anything. She had wondered sometimes if her own stubbornness about the property was something she had learned from watching her mother stay in Santa Fe and keep the house and keep herself. She looked at her mother now, small and fierce and wearing her best black dress, and said, "I think so too." The wedding was not large, but it was warm. Silas Greer from the Mercantile was there, and Della Marsh from the boarding house, and several of the women who brought their mending to Maria, and a few of the ranchers and their families who had known Thomas and were willing to wish Maria well in a second chance at happiness. The town being what it was, there were also those who found reasons to be occupied elsewhere, but Maria had long ago stopped counting on universal approval. Elias stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life, open and certain and lit up from somewhere inside. And when she reached him and they stood facing each other, she could feel his hands on hers, steady and warm. They said their vows in plain words, the old words, and they meant them. After the wedding there was food at the church hall, a table of things brought by various people, pie and bread, and a roasted chicken that Della Marsh had contributed, and dried fruit, and the good chocolate that Greer had been saving for a special occasion. Maria's mother and sister were at the center of everything, and Isabella, who was 20 and bright-eyed and curious about everything, had found Elias within the first 10 minutes and subjected him to what Maria recognized as a thorough and barely disguised interrogation. Later, Isabella found Maria by the food table and said, in the direct way of younger sisters who have decided something, "He is very good. He looked at you the whole time I was talking to him. He answered my questions, but he was watching you." "Isabella," Maria said. "I am just telling you what I observed," Isabella said serenely and helped herself to more pie. Elena and Isabella stayed for 3 days before beginning the ride back to Santa Fe. On the morning they left, Elena took Maria's face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment, the way she had looked at her before every important thing, before her first day of school, before the wedding to Thomas, before Maria had ridden away from Santa Fe as a new wife headed to the territory. "You look like yourself again," Elena said. "I am," Maria said. "Come and visit," Elena said. "Both of you, soon." "We will," Maria said. She watched them ride north until the road bent and they were gone, and then she went back inside where Elias was building up the morning fire, and the house, which had felt hollow and enormous since Thomas died, felt the right size again. The first winter of their marriage was a good one, which in the territory meant that the cold was manageable and the feed held, and no one got seriously sick. They settled into the house and into each other in the way that people do when they have chosen each other honestly and without pretense, working out the small details of shared life, who built the fire in the morning and who took the longer shifts on cold days, and which side of the bed each of them preferred. Elias was not a man who needed a great deal of space inside a house. He was tidy in his habits and quiet in his movements, and he slept well, which Maria found she valued enormously, because Thomas had been a light sleeper, and she had spent years waking at every small sound, and Elias slept with the deep, unconcerned sleep of a man who had spent years on the open ground and trusted the silence of a house entirely. He picked up the mending work as naturally as if he had always done it, sitting in the evenings on the other side of the lamp from her and mending whatever wanted mending, saddle leather or tack or the hems of his own shirts, while she worked on the finer mending that came from town. They talked and they were quiet in turns, and the evenings passed warm and easy. In January, Elias got word that a man he had worked drives with for several years, a rancher named Wade Hollies who ran cattle 50 miles to the east, was looking for someone to help him through spring and early summer with the work of moving cattle to summer pasture and maintaining the eastern fence lines. The wages were good, and the work was within riding distance, meaning Elias could come home on weekends. He asked her what she thought before he decided. She thought it was practical, and she told him so. She also told him that she had managed alone for 14 months and could manage weekdays perfectly well while he was working, and that the wages would go toward things they had been discussing, specifically the expansion of the barn and the purchase of a second mule for the heavier work. He went. He came back every Saturday by midday and stayed until Monday morning, and the weekdays were not empty in the way they had been before. They were full of work and purpose, and on Saturday afternoons she sat beside him on the front step and told him everything that had happened in the week, and he listened to all of it, and she listened to all of his week in return, and it was the kind of marriage she had not known she could have. Culver came one more time in February. This time he came alone and in the early morning and found Elias in the yard repairing a gate hinge before he left for Hollies' ranch. The two men looked at each other. Culver made no pretense this time of having paperwork or reasonable offers. "Carson," he said. "Culver," Elias said, and did not put down the hinge or the wrench. "I want to speak with Mrs. Carson," Culver said, and the use of the new name had a tested quality to it. "Then you can come back at a reasonable hour," Elias said pleasantly. "My wife is sleeping. We do not receive visitors at sunrise." Culver looked at him for a long moment. Something in the look calculated. Elias kept his expression easy and his hands on his work and waited. Culver turned his horse and rode away. He did not come back. Whether it was the marriage, or Elias' presence, or simply the fact that a man who had been trying to acquire a lone widow's property for 3 years finally accepted that the widow was no longer alone and no longer going to yield, Maria could not say. But the spring came and the fence held, and Culver's roan horse was not seen on the road past their property again. The spring was wonderful. The rains came early and were generous, not dangerously so, but enough to soak the garden beds deep and fill the rain barrel twice over. Maria planted the full garden, and then the expanded part she had broken ground on over winter, and the seeds went into soil that had been built up over 2 full seasons of composting and attention, and when they came up strong and thick and unambiguous. The lavender along the south wall flowered for the first time that April, a long purple line of it in the morning light, and the smell of it when the sun warmed it was extraordinary, sweet and deep and unmistakably alive. Maria stood at the south wall with her coffee cup in her hands and breathed it in and felt something that she could only call complete, which was not a feeling she had expected to have, being a person who had always wanted more of everything, more to do, more to grow, more to know. But complete was what it was. She told Elias that morning. She said, "The lavender is flowering and I feel complete," and she said it with a slight embarrassed laugh because it sounded more poetic than she usually allowed herself to be. He looked at the lavender and then at her and said, without any embarrassment at all, "Yes," as if she had stated a fact and he was confirming it. She found out she was pregnant in May. She was not entirely surprised. She had been watching the signs for 2 weeks with the practical knowledge of a woman who grew up in a household full of women and who had paid attention to such things. And by the time she was certain, she had also already decided how she felt about it, which was profoundly glad and somewhat terrified. And when she told Elias sitting at the kitchen table on a warm evening with the door open and the smell of the garden coming in, completely right, he sat very still for a moment. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down in front of her and took both her hands and looked at her with an expression so nakedly moved that she had to look away for a moment or she would have cried. "Maria," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am scared and very well." "I know," he said and squeezed her hands. "I am too," she wrote to her mother. Elena wrote back within 2 weeks, a long letter full of practical advice and warm feeling, and at the end of it she said she would come in the fall to help, and she did not phrase it as an offer but as a statement of fact, which was how Elena did things. The summer was full and busy and very good. Elias had finished his work with Hollies by June and was home full-time, and together they expanded the barn as they had planned, and purchased a second mule, which they named Colonel for reasons that were not entirely clear but which felt right, and the cattle that Elias had quietly been acquiring, 3 head bought at fair prices over the winter, were added to by 2 more in July, and the small herd grazed on the pasture land on the north side of the property that had been unused since Thomas. The tomatoes were the best they had ever been. Maria preserved more jars of tomato than she had ever done in a single season, thick deep red jars lined up on the cool shelf in the back of the house, and she made salsa from the chilies and the tomatoes together, and gave jars of it to Greer for credit at the store, and to Della Marsh who asked for it particularly, and to her neighbor on the south side, a woman named Ruby Tanner who was elderly and sharp-tongued, and had been quietly kind to Maria in the worst months of widowhood without making a show of it. Ruby Tanner came to the garden fence one afternoon and looked at the rows of growing things for a long time and then looked at Maria and said, "That is the best-looking garden in the county." "It has good soil," Maria said. "It has someone who cares about it," Ruby said. "That is the thing, same as people," she nodded at the house. "He is good to you." "Yes," Maria said, and she meant it simply and completely. "Good," Ruby said and went back to her own property, and that was the end of it. The baby was born in December of 1879, on the 15th, in the middle of a night that was cold and clear and absolutely still. Maria's mother had arrived in late October and had made herself indispensable in the household with the efficiency of a woman who had delivered or assisted at a considerable number of births and had opinions about how these things ought to be done. The midwife from Harlan's Creek, a capable woman named Harriet Cole, who had been delivering babies in the territory for 20 years, came when the time was right, and between her and Elena, they conducted the whole business with a calm authority that Maria found both reassuring and, at certain points, slightly maddening. Elias spent the hours outside the bedroom alternating between sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug of cooling coffee and walking quietly back and forth in the yard in the cold. Maria could hear his boots on the boards of the step when he came back inside each time, a particular rhythm she knew, and found steadying even through the hard hours of labor. When she finally heard him come in and stand outside the bedroom door and the midwife opened it and said, plainly, "You have a son," she could hear the breath go out of him from inside the room. Elias came to the side of the bed and she put their son into his arms, wrapped in the blanket she had sewn through the fall, and watched his face. He held the infant with the careful confidence of a man who had held things that needed handling, and he looked at his son with an expression that Maria thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to find words for, something total, something that went all the way down. "What will we name him?" Elias asked, very quietly, not looking up from the child. "Thomas," Maria said. She had thought about it for months and she was sure. "Thomas Elias Carson." He looked at her then. "Thomas," he said, and his voice was careful with it. "He was a good man," Maria said simply, "and this is still his land partly, and there is nothing in our happiness that undoes what he was or what he meant." She looked at their son. "I want him to have a name with good men in it." Elias nodded slowly, and he was quiet for a moment. Thomas Elias Carson, he said. That is a good name. It is, Maria agreed. Alina came in and exclaimed over the baby in Spanish and English alternately, and then sent Elias out to eat something real because, she said, a man that color did not need to be standing up any longer. He went without argument, which said something about the state of him. Maria heard her mother talking to him in the kitchen, the low, comfortable sound of it, and she lay back and held her son against her chest, and listened to the voices of the people she loved in the house that was hers, and felt the truth of what she had said to Elias that night on the step. I want the things I am not careful about wanting, and all the wanting had come true, every piece of it. Her mother stayed through January, and then rode back to Santa Fe with a promise of a summer visit, and Maria and Elias settled into the new configuration of their life with Thomas in it. He was a serious baby, watchful and quiet in ways that sometimes made Maria feel she was being assessed, and occasionally he would fix her with a look of such concentrated attention that she laughed out loud, because it was exactly the look she had gotten from his father on the first morning she had ever seen him, standing at the edge of a dead garden with the sun coming up, taking everything in. The second spring was even better than the first had been. Elias, who had spent the winter in the long evenings reading the agricultural pamphlets that the Territorial Extension Office put out, which Maria had sent away for on the basis of a notice in the weekly paper from Tucson, had ideas about crop rotation and about improving the water management of the eastern beds. They talked through all of it at the kitchen table in the winter evenings, with Thomas sleeping in the cradle that Elias had built in the autumn, and in the spring, they put all of it into practice. Maria wrote to her mother and to Isabella, and to two women she had known in Santa Fe who had also gone to the territory and built things there. And she wrote about the garden and the cattle and the new season and Thomas, who was sitting up now and looking at everything with his serious eyes. She wrote in almost every letter about the lavender, which had spread along the south wall until it was twice the length she had originally planted, and which in April and May bloomed so heavily that the smell of it could be detected from the road. A traveler stopped once, a woman passing through with her husband and their two small children on a wagon heading further west, and she asked about the lavender because she could smell it from the road and could not identify the source, and Maria cut her several stalks and wrapped them in paper from the kitchen, and the woman held them to her face and closed her eyes for a moment with an expression that Maria recognized. "It smells like something good," the woman said. "Yes," Maria agreed. "It does." Spring turned to summer. Thomas learned to crawl with a determined efficiency that required moving certain things from lower shelves, and Elias took this development with such cheerful practicality that Maria fell in love with him incrementally all over again, watching him remove the ceramic jug from the low shelf with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, setting it higher, and turning to find his son already investigating the newly vacated shelf with evident satisfaction. In the summer, Isabella came to visit. She was 21 now, and she had grown into herself since the wedding, had taken on some of their mother's quality of complete certainty about who she was, and she arrived with 2 bags and a box of gifts from their mother, and an energy that immediately expanded the house in the best way. She played with Thomas with total absorption, lying on the floor and making faces until he laughed his deep, solid baby laugh, and she helped in the garden with genuine interest and a willingness to be dirty that Maria had always found appealing in her. She stayed 6 weeks. She helped with the canning of the summer's abundance, and she learned from Elias how to gentle the young horse he had acquired in the spring, standing in the corral in her working dress with her hands quiet and her voice low the way he showed her, until the horse came to her and pushed its nose against her palm. On her last evening she sat on the front step with Maria, both of them with coffee, and she said, "You are very happy." "Yes," Maria said. "I mean properly happy," Isabella said. "Not the kind where a person is managing, the kind where a person has actually got what they wanted." Maria looked out at the garden in the late evening light, the lavender going dark, the tomato plants heavy, the beans climbing their stakes, and at the corral where Elias was finishing up with the horses, moving with that familiar unhurried ease, and at the sound coming from inside the house, which was Thomas talking to himself in his crib in the specific and earnest way he had lately been talking to himself. "Yes," Maria said. "That kind." Isabella nodded once as if something had been confirmed. "Good," she said. In the fall, Maria found out she was pregnant again. This time she was less scared and more certain, and she told Elias at supper in a plain and direct way that made him set down his fork and look at her with the same total stillness as the first time, and then the same warmth spreading across his face. When he asked, "April, I think," she said, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but very well." This pregnancy was easier than the first, or perhaps she simply knew more about what to expect. She kept working in the garden through the fall, Elias making no comment about this because he knew better and because Maria was not a person who needed to be managed. And the fall canning happened on schedule, and the winter preparations went forward, and Thomas, who was now walking in the determined, lurching way of a child of 13 months, investigated everything in the house with an enthusiasm that required the entire family's attention. Elena came again in March and stayed until May, arriving just before the birth and staying long enough to help establish the new rhythm of the household. The second child was born on a rainy April morning, and it was a girl this time, and they named her Elena for Maria's mother and for the grandmother who had shaped both of them. And Elena Whitfield Carson, who would be called Ellie from the first week of her life, came into the world with strong lungs and strong opinions, and it was clear within a very short time, the specific brand of indestructible certainty that her grandmother and her mother and her aunt all possessed. The grandmother Elena held her namesake and looked at her for a long time and then looked at Maria. "She is going to be something," she said. "I know," Maria said from the bed. "I mean trouble," Elena said, but she was smiling when she said it. Young Thomas regarded his sister with the serious assessment of a 16-month-old who is not entirely sure what has happened to the household's previous arrangements and is reserving judgment. By the time Ellie was a month old and he had established that she was not going anywhere, he settled into the role of observant older sibling with the same equanimity that characterized everything about him. The summer of 1881 was long and good. The garden was the best it had ever been. 3 years of composting and crop rotation, and the rain barrel that kept the beds from drying out between rains, had built the soil into something rich and dark and alive, and the plants grew in it with the uncomplicated confidence of things in their right place. The lavender had now spread the entire length of the south wall and turned the corner toward the east, a wide ribbon of purple and gray-green that in the morning light and the evening light both looked like something from a painting. Elias had expanded the cattle herd to 12 head, a practical and manageable number for the size of their pasture, and in the spring he had sold 4 calves at good prices in Harlan's Creek, and the money had gone toward the things on the list they kept on the kitchen shelf: the new cook stove that replaced the aging one, the repair of the eastern fence that had been bothering him since winter, and a small amount put aside in the tin box that lived in the top of the wardrobe. He was teaching Thomas, who was 2.5 now and deeply interested in animals, about the horses. Teaching was perhaps a grand word for what was essentially Elias crouching in the dirt of the corral, while Thomas pushed his small hands against the horse's nose with an expression of intense concentration. But the horses were tolerant, and Elias was patient, and something genuine was being transmitted. On a September evening, with the children in bed and the garden going gold in the last of the light, and the smell of the lavender coming in through the open door, Maria sat at the kitchen table with her good writing paper and wrote a letter to her mother and to Isabella and to the 2 women in the territory. She wrote about the garden and the cattle and the children and Elias, and she wrote about the way the lavender had turned the corner of the south wall that summer and was now heading east. At the end of the letter to her mother, she wrote, "Do you remember when you came for Thomas's birth and you said I looked like myself again? I want you to know that I am even more myself than that now. I think I am more myself than I have ever been. I think this land and this garden and this man and these children have made me more of who I was supposed to be. And I know that sounds like something from a novel, but it is true, and I am not embarrassed to say it. Tell Isabella her namesake niece is already trying to stand up by holding the legs of the kitchen table, which seems early and also entirely predictable. She sealed the letters and set them aside for the next mail day, and she went to the door and stood there looking out at the evening, at the long purple line of the lavender along the south wall, at the garden beds dark and satisfied after the day's watering, at the corral where the horses stood in the last light. She heard Elias come up behind her and felt his hands on her shoulders, warm and present, and she leaned back slightly against him. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The beans are going to need to come in this week," he said, "before the first frost." "I know," she said, "and the last of the tomatoes." "I know that too," she said, "and Colonel has been favoring his right front leg." "Elias," she said, "yes, I know about the beans and the tomatoes and Colonel's leg," she said. "I was looking at everything, not taking inventory." She could feel the smile in him where her back was against his chest. "What does everything look like?" he asked. She thought about it. "Like 3 years ago I was kneeling in the dirt crying over dead plants," she said. "And now the dirt is good and the plants are not dead and someone came back." He put his arms around her from behind and his chin came down near her temple, and they stood in the doorway together and looked at the evening, at the garden, at the land that was theirs. "I will always come back," he said, and it was not a vow in the formal sense, but it was as true and as binding as anything she had ever heard. "I know," she said. The October sky above the Whitfield Carson property was the particular deep clear blue of the high desert in autumn, and the air had that crystalline quality that comes after the first cold nights, clean and sharp, and full of the smell of dry grass and turned earth, and from the south wall of the adobe house, lavender, still holding a few late blooms, still sending its scent out into the long light of the afternoon. Inside the house, Thomas was asleep on his cot and Ellie was asleep in her cradle, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet when the children were sleeping, a quality of held breath and peace. Maria sat on the front step with her mending in her lap, not because the mending was urgent, but because the afternoon was too beautiful to be inside entirely, and she worked and listened to the particular silence of a good life. The sound of a horse on the road made her look up. It was Elias, coming back from Harlan's Creek, where he had gone in the morning to settle their account at Greer's store and to leave the letter she had written. He came through the gate and tied the horse and crossed the yard to where she sat, and he held out a paper-wrapped parcel. She looked at it and then at him. "What is this?" "Greer had a shipment in from Tucson," he said. "I saw it and I thought of you." She took the parcel and unwrapped it. Inside was a small paper packet of seeds, and the label on it, handwritten in the same kind of plain, careful lettering as the first lavender seeds on a morning 3 years ago, said, "Jasmine, climbing variety, good for south-facing walls." She looked at the packet for a long moment. She looked at the south wall, where the lavender grew thick and purple and abundant and full of 3 years of everything that had happened. There was space on the east end where the lavender had not yet reached, where something new could grow. "You remembered," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "You mentioned it once," he said, "in the spring, that you had always wanted jasmine." She had mentioned it once, in the middle of a conversation about the garden's expansion, almost in passing. He had said nothing about it then. He had remembered it until October, until a shipment came in from Tucson that happened to include climbing jasmine seeds. She got up from the step and held the packet against her chest and looked at him in the afternoon light, her husband of 3 years, the father of her children, The man who had ridden 8 miles to Ridgeway in the night and come back before sunrise with seeds and soil, and the quiet intention of helping her grow something from what had died. "I love you," she said. She said it in the plain, direct way she said everything, without embellishment and without apology, looking at him fully. He looked back at her the same way. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you said the offer of lavender seeds stood." She laughed, that real unguarded laugh she had first produced kneeling in the wet garden at the sight of the first bean sprout, and he stepped forward and kissed her in the afternoon sun in front of the house that was theirs, and the garden that was theirs, and the land that was theirs. And behind them, the lavender moved in a small October wind, and somewhere inside the house, Ellie woke up from her nap and began to address the world at volume, and Thomas stirred and said something indistinct. And it was all completely and entirely what it was supposed to be. Maria Whitfield Carson, who had once knelt in the dust of a dead garden and cried alone in the early morning, with the feeling that everything was lost, planted the jasmine seeds along the east end of the south wall the following morning, pressing each one into the good dark soil with her own hands, in the company of her husband and her son and her daughter, in the high desert light of an October morning in New Mexico in the year 1881, and she patted the earth over them with the steady, certain touch of a woman who knows how to help things grow, and she looked up at the ridge to the east where the sun came over every day without fail, and she was glad of every single thing. The jasmine, when it came up in the spring, grew like it had been waiting. It reached the first length of the wall before the lavender was in full bloom, climbing with a quick, confident energy, and when it flowered in June, the smell of it combined with the lavender into something entirely new, something that was both of them and neither of them. And on the morning it first bloomed, Maria stood at the south wall and breathed it in and thought of all the things that had been planted in the past 3 years, all the seeds and all the effort and all the roots going deep under the dry ground, finding their own water, building themselves strong enough to survive whatever summer came. She was 30 years old. She had a garden that was the best in the county and a husband who came back when he said he would, and 2 children who were becoming themselves with the same inexorable confidence as everything that grew in good soil. She had a south wall that smelled of lavender and jasmine, and a rain barrel that was never empty, and a house that felt the right size, and a piece of land that was unambiguously hers. She had all of it, and she had earned all of it, and she was glad. The morning went on around her, bright and clear and warm, and the garden grew in the good soil. And from inside the house she could hear Elias talking to Thomas about the horses in his low, unhurried voice, and Ellie laughing at something. And the sound of the house full of life was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Even more beautiful than the lavender was beautiful, even more beautiful than the jasmine. And she stood in the morning with her hands at her sides and her face in the sun, and let it all be true.